Welcome, everyone. I'm Dick Deming. I'm Medical Director of Mercy One Cancer Center and also the founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. Welcome to our weekly cancer education series. It's brought to you in part by a grant from the Iowa Oncology Society. Our topic tonight is clinical trials, and our guest is Shannon Harden. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you.
Shannon is a research nurse at Mercy One Cancer Center and Iowa Oncology Research Association. So we're going to talk about clinical trials, but before we do, let's learn a little bit about you. So where are you from originally, Shannon?
From here in Des Moines, the north side of Des Moines.
Okay. Where'd you go to high school?
Sadell.
Sadell High School. That's one of those like in-between places that.
Yep.
And how many in your class?
98.
And what was your claim to fame in high school? At Sadell High.
I don't know that I had one. Fly under the radar?
Under the radar, okay. Music, sports, speech? No? And then when you graduated, where did you go for college?
DMAC. And then I worked for a while and decided to be a nurse and went on to Iowa Methodist School of Nursing, which is no longer there.
Right. And got your RN.
Yep.
And what was your first job as a nurse after you got your RN?
At that time, a nurse couldn't find a full-time job. So I worked 3 jobs. I worked at Blank, PRN. I worked at Mercy as part-time more. That was almost a full-time position. And I did some phlebotomy on the side.
Oh, wow.
Went to people's homes and drew blood and insurance exams for insurance. Yep.
And how long now have you been doing clinical trials research?
6 years.
Okay.
6 years next month.
Good. So when we think about cancer research, I think people think of a couple of different things. Some people conjure up being in a lab with test tubes and inventing new drugs as cancer research. But clinical trials research is quite a bit different than that. So how would you explain what clinical trials research is?
So we're not in a lab. We might draw some labs or blood and process it or send it off to the study as part of a study requirement. But most of the time, we know the protocol. We're helping the patient navigate through that protocol. We're helping the physician navigate through the protocol because it might be a little bit different than the standard of care.
So it's enrolling patients into studies.
Yeah.
And so clinical trials, enrolling patients into studies. I think of the classic clinical trial, which would be a randomized prospective double-blind study where you might be looking at treatment A versus treatment B for a patient with cancer and enrolling the patient to see if they would be willing to undergo randomization and then determining which treatment they get. There are different types of trials that you enroll patients for. So the classic one would be a treatment trial, like I just mentioned. What are the other categories besides a treatment trial? And then we'll talk about a treatment trial, each of those categories in more depth.
Yep. So a treatment trial can be a couple of different things. It can be the standard of care in one arm of the randomization process. And part 2 or the other randomization arm might be adding another drug, or it could be de-escalating treatment to see which has the better outcome. So
obviously the only way we can make advances in cancer care is to try new ways of doing things.
Yeah.
But it's not like you do treatment versus no treatment. Almost all of the trials would be a patient, and a trial typically would be one type of cancer at a particular stage, and the patient would be randomized to the best treatment we have today versus another treatment, and often that is the best treatment we have today plus an extra drug.
Yeah.
So in the last 10 years, we've been doing many of those studies where it's been the best chemotherapy that we know, and the other arm is the best chemotherapy plus an immunotherapy along with it.
Yes.
That was a common design of cancer treatments. You also mentioned de-escalation. So that's something a lot of people don't think about.
Yep. So a couple of them that we have open right now are actually de-escalating breast cancer. So if they meet the protocol requirements, they could be randomized to either get radiation with breast cancer or eliminate that with breast cancer.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
some types of cancer at certain stages, the cure rate is so high that we're not likely to come up with a treatment that has better results. So we're thinking, okay, maybe they don't need all of this treatment and you could reduce the side effects.
Mhm.
So those studies that typically have a de-escalation phase are ones where the stage and the type of cancer or the prognosis is so good
Mhm.
that we're wondering whether we're causing too many side effects by giving too much treatment.
Yep.
Some of the diseases where we have seen that happen recently is, for example, early stage Hodgkin's disease. We, no doubt, in retrospect, the treatment got so aggressive and the cure rate was so high that we were clearly
Mhm.
over treating some of those patients, but you don't know whether you can get the same good results unless you do
Right.
a study. Another one that comes to mind is the HPV mediated oral pharynx cancer in the early stages. We've started now looking at, can you do a lower dose of radiation? Can you, instead of treating both the right and left side of the neck, so there are times where you can only treat one or the other,
Mhm.
or other ways of de-escalating the chemotherapy.
Mhm.
Can you think of other situations where we've done de-escalation studies? You mentioned the breast cancer. So we think that in some women with early stage,
Yeah.
that we can safely omit either the radiation or de-escalate the chemotherapy, or and
Mhm.
still end up with the same good results.
Yeah. I can't think of any other de-escalation ones. There's a couple that are breast cancers that are de-escalating the dose of chemotherapy too, that we have open
So
right
it could
now.
be the duration, either the dose of the chemotherapy or the duration of the chemotherapy.
Fewer cycles.
Okay.
Mhm.
So that's one general category of the clinical trials, is the treatments clinical trials. What's another category of clinical trials that we enroll patients in?
Going to the other spectrum of it is preventative cancer trials. So we've had open at Mercy One since I've been here, a mammogram study. So it's comparing 2D versus 3D mammogram on preventing breast cancer. So it's a preventative trial.
Well, actually, wouldn't that be a screening trial? Isn't that like
more
a screening
of a screening
trial? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the mammograms don't actually prevent cancer. They just,
Mhm.
and I think it's the first major cancer screening study that's been done like in either 30 or 50 years. So maybe explain what that study was.
Yep. So it's the patient agrees to be randomized and a consent is signed, and then they agree to be randomized to either get a 2D mammogram for the duration of the study or a 3D mammogram for the duration of the study.
So,
and we follow along and collect the data with it.
And how many patients did we enroll at Mercy?
Close to 250.
250 patients, and then it's a nationwide study, or is it a
Worldwide.
worldwide study? And did they finally met their accrual?
Yep, in December.
How many patients have been accrued to that study?
I don't.
I mean,
Thousands,
something
hundreds
like
of thousands.
200,000
Just under
patients.
200,000.
Yeah. So this will be a study that will determine whether 3D mammography is better than 2D mammography. It does expose women to a bit more radiation, and it does cost more. And there'd never been a study looking to see whether one form of mammogram versus the other was superior. So a major study. So all the patients have been accrued into the study, but the study will continue on
through 2027.
Okay. So once a year, the women will continue to get either 2D or 3D. And so I think it's a total of 5 years of mammograms?
5 to 8 years, depending on when they enrolled.
Okay. So that's a study that we enrolled a lot of patients on. And what are some of the other classifications of clinical trials?
So a preventative one, we don't have open at Mercy, but we've talked about it many times, just haven't done it yet, is there's a colon cancer prevention. So it's looking at the colonoscopies, and if somebody's had a polyp removed, one or two, what is the appropriate follow-up time, or looking at the follow-up time of when they should come back. Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? And so that's what that study's
Okay.
looking at.
So
we're working
standard
on that
right
one.
now is 5 years, correct?
Correct.
So, and the reason that's considered a preventive study, even though colonoscopy is a screening test, we know that it can actually prevent cancers, because in the act of doing a screening colonoscopy to look for colon cancer, if a benign polyp is seen, it is removed, and that could have over time grown into a cancer. So we're trying to figure out what's the best time. Do you really need to do a follow-up scan in 5 years? Could you do it in 10 years?
Yep. So another category that we have is observational studies, or where they're looking at side effects. We have a couple of them that are related to immunotherapy. So the patient completes many surveys, and we're following along for side effects of immunotherapy as well.
Okay. So immunotherapy is one of the newer forms of systemic treatment, and the immunotherapy doesn't kill the cancer cells directly. It activates or takes the brake off the immune system and makes the medication makes the immune system work more effectively to find and treat the cancer. But you can have lots of different side effects sometimes.
Yes.
Most patients tolerate it well, but activating your body's own immune system can sometimes cause your own immune system to fight the own
hyper mode.
hyper mode, and actually cause inflammation in various parts of the body.
Right.
Has that one been a large accruing study?
Yes. Very much so.
So it's open to patients getting immunotherapy for many different types of cancer.
Many different types.
Yeah. Other categories of studies, I know that we have some that are specifically for certain side effects.
Yep. So some symptom management trials, where that might be fatigue, it might be insomnia, it might be pain, and there's lots of different things that the studies are looking at with those.
Very good. I think most people are really those patients that have either cancers where the prognosis is not great, or stage 4 cancers where they've already been through many different treatments, are often looking for clinical trials because they've sort of run out of the conventional treatments. Do you have the opportunity to interact with patients, and maybe explain, how do we decide which clinical trials we have open with IORA? And maybe we'll back up a little bit. Maybe talk about what is IORA, and what types of clinical trials do we open in terms of NCI versus pharmaceutical, et cetera.
Yeah, so IORA is Iowa Oncology Research Association, and we work with Mercy One. We have a group over at Unity Point. We work with Mission. We work with Broadlawns. We're also part of a national organization through the NCI, or the National Cancer Institute, where we have a grant that funds us for those services. And with our N Corp, we're just one little piece. There's 32 N Corps across the nation, and we're in 44 states.
And the N Corp stands for the National Cancer Institute Community Oncology Research Program.
Right. And so with that, we work with multiple research bases that are opening clinical trials all the time, every day, and looking at different things. So when the trials are getting ready to open, they do big broadcasts. We take them to our physicians and say, what do you think? Should we open it? Should we not? Do we have the population for that specific disease type? Those types of things. So it kind of goes through a panel of physicians looking at the logistics. Can we meet all of the study requirements here? And most of the time we can.
Right.
So.
And so we have in the Des Moines metro area, what, 60 or 70 different clinical trials that are
Probably
open?
well over 100 right
Well over
now.
100 now.
Yeah.
And again, the reason that we do the community oncology research program is 50 years ago, the only way you could enter a clinical trial would be to be at the NCI or at a university setting.
Mhm.
And 85% of cancer patients in the United States are treated at community cancer centers. So if you want to advance cancer and enroll more patients in clinical trials, if you limit it to the NCI or to the universities, you're only going to include 15% of cancer
Mhm.
patients. So by developing the programs like NCORP, comprehensive community cancer centers that demonstrate excellence and ability and care can open clinical trials that have been developed at universities or at the NCI and follow the protocols and enroll patients.
Yes.
So at community cancer centers all over the United States, patients are being enrolled and more patients can enter the study. You can complete the studies more quickly. You can find out whether the study was positive or negative and advance cancer care that way.
Yes.
And it takes a commitment of time, though, on behalf of not only nurses that are hired specifically to do the research, but the docs who agree to participate in the in recruiting patients and following the protocols.
Yeah. And we recruit our patients. A lot come from the physicians directly. They've seen a new patient or an existing patient. We're also looking behind the scenes at who they're seeing and what's changing, and do we have a trial that fits their needs, and then we reach out to that physician. We have the physician on board, and then we're lock in step. If they agree to it, we reach out to the patient. Sometimes the physician does on our behalf, so everybody's on the same page and we follow along. The research nurse is there, especially a treatment trial, for every visit. Lock in step.
What's one of the more popular clinical trials that we're doing for treatment right now that you're enrolling patients in?
We have a study that has a lot of multiple myeloma patients on it.
And is it a study that looks at 2 different treatment regimens?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe walk us through how,
I don't
not the exact treatments, but how you enroll a patient and how you are then engaged in the patient's treatment.
So we, again, once we have the physician on board and meeting those study requirements, we're looking, there's eligibility requirements that the patient has to meet. So we look at all of those eligibility requirements. If it's looking good, things are a thumbs up and we're ready to go, then
so
we reach out to the patient.
You know by looking at the schedule that there's a multiple myeloma patient coming in. So then you'll look at their clinical data, what's their age, what's the stage, what's their various lab work to see whether they meet the eligibility requirement to be enrolled. And then at what point is there the physician saying they want to put the patient or want them to be considered?
Both at the same time. Once
So
we've identified them, we're looking and we're asking questions and is this a good fit? And sharing the protocol and having a discussion with the physician.
And then does the physician invite you into the office to talk to the patient?
Sometimes, and sometimes it's maybe the patient's already left. And so then we're making a phone call to the patient.
Okay.
Or sometimes the physician calls the patient and says, you'll be hearing from research.
Okay.
So, and then we give them some information about it. If they're very interested, we kind of talk about next steps, consenting process. In our new electronic world, we send consents electronically, but we do meet them for an in-person signature most of the time.
And maybe talk a little bit about that initial meeting with the patient, whether it's in person or on the phone. I mean, do you think most patients embrace the idea that they're eligible for a clinical trial and feel special and want to do it? Or do they feel like, oh, you're trying to talk me into being a guinea pig
I've heard both.
For science?
I've heard, some people are very excited. We've even had people reach out to us and ask us about clinical trials. They've searched and they found out that we had a trial open. So they were already knowledgeable about it and wanted to learn more and how they could get on the trial. And then, yes, sometimes when you call a patient, I don't want to be a guinea pig. Um, I'm going to get a placebo, or maybe not get any treatment at all. And so it's just breaking down the study and explaining it step by step
Mhm.
along the way, and
Right.
what the two treatment arms are and what to expect.
And by the time it gets to a treatment study, there's been so many preliminary bits of information that you don't go to the National Cancer Institute, doesn't go to the time and expense of mounting a study if there isn't some reasonable expectation that it may be positive and may
Right.
it actually advance
Yeah.
cancer care.
Mhm.
So it's not like, oh, we just grab a drug off the shelf. By the time you get to the phase 3 studies, it's a reasonable expectation that
Right.
it may help improve cancer care.
And most of ours are phase 3 trials.
Mhm.
So they've been through that vetting process along the way.
Maybe briefly describe,
Mhm.
the difference between a phase 1, a phase 2, and a phase 3.
Mhm.
And I can help you
Okay,
with that.
good.
Yeah. As you said,
Yeah.
most of the studies that we do in the community cancer centers are phase 3.
Yeah.
And
a phase 1 is definitely done at a larger institution, a major university, a major hospital. It's very limited in the number of patients they put on it. It's very supervised in side effects of whatever that medication is that they're giving.
Right.
And they're kind of gauging it from there. And if it makes it out of that phase 1, then it goes to a phase 2 where they kind of expand it a little bit. Okay, we had pretty good success here, so let's expand it and do a little bit of standard of care and a little bit and adjust doses and things like that.
And I would add that a phase 1 is really primarily looking at the side effects of the drug.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not randomized, and it's usually done on patients who have quite advanced disease. And it is a drug that we really don't know how much it's going to help in that cancer. And we really don't even know what's the proper dose and what the side effects. So phase 1 is done patients having no other good options and patients who really want to truly help science. Phase 2 is then a drug that the appropriate dose, the side effect regimen, and then you really want to see how effective it is in actually working with the cancer. Both the phase 1 and phase 2 may be just single arm. So if a patient agrees, they know before they agree what treatment they're going to get.
Right.
It's not like you're going to get treatment A or treatment B. Everybody who agrees to do this small study with phase 1 is going to get the treatment. And most of the phase 2 are also single arm rather than randomized.
Mm-hmm.
But by now we know at the point of phase 1 and phase 2, the drug may not even have a name.
It's a number.
It may be XG7246.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. By the time we get to phase 3, most of the drugs have names, but sometimes they don't. And as you said, phase 3, we know the side effect profile of the drug, of all the drugs. We know kind of the efficacy, but how well they work. But we're considering oftentimes adding a new drug to a regimen.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So that's a little bit of the difference between phase 1, 2, and 3. Phase 1 is really probably the greatest risk to the patient because we don't actually know the side effects and we don't know if it's going to work. And so those tend to be done at the university settings rather than out in the community.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Some of the times, so if a patient agrees to participate in a study, maybe talk a little bit about what are the rights of patients, because doing research on human subjects is has a lot of oversight.
Yes.
And lots of safety built into the process.
Yes.
Maybe talk a bit about that.
So in the consent that we go through with the patient, it talks about side effects of both arms of the study, so the patient understands that. There's also an option to get out of a clinical trial. I'm having terrible side effects that I didn't anticipate. Life gets in the way. I can't do this anymore. then we can remove a patient from a
So
clinical
patients have the
trial.
ability to
Ability to
opt
get
out
off.
anytime they want,
Yep.
even if they signed the consent form saying they're going to do this clinical trial, if they want to
Yep.
stop, and then they can go to conventional treatment.
Correct. They
Mhm.
would go back to their physician standard of care or whatever other options are available.
Okay.
Yeah. So, again, we walk them through both arms of the study. How to, there's often optional blood, optional tissue that goes along with studies that we send out to the research base so they can study that tissue, that blood, along with the treatment plan to see those
Mhm.
effects of that drug.
And
Yep.
as we say, a lot of scrutiny, and all of the trials before they're ever open have to go through several layers of research boards that look at the study on paper and determine, have we put enough safeguards in place? Is the consent form accurately describe the side effects? What are all of the follow-up tests that they want to do? How many CAT scans, how many PET scans, how many biopsies? All of that factors
Right.
into whether a study, by the time it gets to us, is considered safe and appropriate with safeguards in place.
Yep. And we always tell patients to check with their insurance, although a lot of times on a treatment trial, the study will pick up the cost of the experimental drug.
Mhm.
Not usually standard of care, but occasionally they will. So patients will know what their out-of-pocket cost is. They may have more visits to their physician. They may have more scans, more lab costs due to the information that we're gathering for the study.
And for the most part, insurance covers all of the standard treatment and the standard laboratory tests and the standard x-rays that are done for patients on a clinical trial. They're obviously not going to pay for the experimental drug,
Right.
even if it's an FDA approved drug but hasn't been approved for this situation. So most of the time, the insurance doesn't create an obstacle for patients
Right.
participating.
Yeah. Correct. Very rarely.
Okay. And then your role as a research nurse. So now you have met with Mr. John Doe, who has multiple myeloma, and determined that he is a candidate based on his physical condition, the type of myeloma, and his blood tests and
Yep.
the other. So, and he says that he would like to participate.
So if we haven't consented him, we have him sign the informed consent. Patient receives a copy of that informed consent, and then we register with the study and get the randomization going. Order any study medications.
So let's say it's a 2-arm study. Arm 1, which is standard of care, and Arm 2, which is standard of care, plus, let's say, immunotherapy. How long does it take from the time you enter into the computer, Mr. John Doe has signed his consent form and is ready to learn whether he gets treatment A or treatment B?
That's pretty quick. Within, like, as soon as we enter it in the
Within
computer,
minutes.
Yeah.
Within minutes.
So sometimes, if they consented last week, but now we've got all of our I's dotted and T's crossed, and we're ready to register, I'll call the patient and say, I'm ready to register you today. Are we still good to go? Yes, I am. Okay, I'll call you back in a few minutes and tell you
Gotcha.
what you were randomized
So then you
to.
register, click the button, and they
Right.
tell you,
Yep.
Mr. John Doe has been assigned to.
Yep. And then I've got my pharmacy on standby to order medication. I notify the physician, so we have a treatment plan in place, knowing which arm the patient was randomized to, and then they set a treatment date to start. And then we're there for that very first visit, and we're there for the very last visit. So see the patient through.
If the patient, one arm is all standard treatment, is all of that drug acquired through the normal channels in the medical oncology office?
Yes.
Yeah.
Unless the study pays for it.
Okay.
Yeah, which is pretty rare.
So the standard treatment is usually paid by insurance, and so that's ordered the same way. Then the experimental arm, there's a different process by which those drugs are gotten or
Right.
obtained and taken to this.
Yep.
In this multiple myeloma, are they all infusions or are they oral?
Some are injectables,
Injectable.
and oral
Uh-huh.
medications.
But with the
Mhm.
experimental arm, you would actually then be taking the drugs out to the medical oncologist because
Correct.
they're not acquired through the pharmacy.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And then do you meet with the patients on a regular basis while they're
Yes.
going through the study?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. We're just another layer, another
Mhm.
resource. They've got our cell phone numbers.
And obviously
Yeah.
the medical oncologist and the nurses that are caring for the patients have to record a lot of data
Yep.
that gets uploaded. Do you then, as the clinical trials nurse, do any assessments of the patients while they're going through, or is that done by their care team?
On a treatment trial, most often it's done by the physician
care
and
team.
the care team.
And then you're involved
There might be
with making
surveys
sure.
involved, or there might be a neurocognitive test for a study that we will administer those
Okay.
neurocognitive testing or a survey. We've had one that was a grip test for strength. So in an elderly population. So we'll kind of insert ourselves. If the doctor's running behind, we might go in and do that, keep them busy. If the doctor's running on time, we might do it after. So just so we can get all of the data collected that's needed for the study.
And then when the study, all of the treatment has been administered and the patient is no longer getting any chemo, but now is in the observation phase,
Mhm.
doing the testing to see what has been the results. At what point ever does the patient find out which arm that they were on?
Well, in the treatment trials, they're told which arm they're getting. If it's a blinded study, typically it's not unblinded unless it's an emergency.
Right.
So if it's a blinded study, not very often. But
until
I do
the
have,
study has already closed.
right,
Yeah.
until all that data is
Yeah.
collected and it's published.
So obviously the example that we gave
Yeah.
is like most of them, the patients know because you tell them which arm they're going
Right.
to be on. And I guess what I meant to ask was, at what point do they ever know the results of the study overall?
Yeah, when the study closes.
Mhm.
Um,
And is there a way of feedback so that patients who are on the study learn of the results of the study, or do they?
yeah, I keep like a list, and if somebody wants to know, and we finished the study 2 years ago,
Mhm.
if I get information on
And
it, I'll
just got
share it.
published in
Yeah.
the New England Journal, then you'll get
Yeah.
back to the
Yep.
patients and
If I
say,
find it, I'll
just
send
want to
it.
thank you
Yep.
again for participating. Here is the
Mhm.
results of the study, and
Mhm.
here is
Yep.
how it turned out.
Mhm. We can also direct them to the National Cancer Institute because all of that information is published there on their
Mhm.
study. And so some patients do go out there from time to time and look to see if there's any new information.
And people may not
Mhm.
know, so we'll tell them that participating in this clinical study, the patient has to fill out a bit more paperwork, but the doctors and nurses have to fill out more paperwork, send in the data, and then there's a whole audit process by which the National Cancer Institute audits the treatment of patients under clinical trials to go through the records to see was everything done
Mhm.
correctly, were all the blood tests done on time, were the treatments administered exactly the way they should be.
Right. So, well, when
a
we're
fun
not,
part of everything is
yeah,
auditing.
in a day when we're not seeing patients, we're looking at queries, data entry, we're entering that information, answering questions back from the study, following along. They come in and they audit us. Some come in person, some do it virtual now, and they look at our charts from start to finish.
So
So they're the same across everybody who's enrolled. We're on a level playing field.
So 4 years ago, when we designed the physical space that you're in, we had to have lots of cabinets because back then almost everything was still being done on paper.
Yes.
even though we're in the 21st century,
Yes.
patients being treated on clinical trial, the NCI required paper documents.
Yes.
Have we moved forward in
We're
the?
getting there.
We're getting there.
We're hoping by the end of the year we'll be
We'll
electronic.
be able to be electronic and not have to
with
have
very few papers.
Yeah, because and the size of the paper charts have just increased because now
They're big.
all the data is put into a computer and you spit out a what that visit was, whereas in olden days a visit might have been one sheet of paper, and now every visit is like 100 sheets of paper.
Yes.
And so those paper charts get really big and fat. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Heavy.
What are some of the other issues that patients will bring up either while you're going through the consenting phase or during the course of treatment?
Side effects.
Mhm.
Side effects are, I think, the ones. Sometimes it even gets into because they're having frequent scans, maybe their out-of-pocket cost for their scans is expensive, and how can we get help to pay for that? Unfortunately, the studies don't pay for that. So we're looking for other resources and putting them in touch with a navigator or a social worker to help with those costs.
Mhm.
So, but we're along the way through the whole thing.
And I would imagine that you develop relationships with these
Yes.
patients. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That has to be one of the more enjoyable and
Yes.
professional fulfilling
Mm-hmm.
aspects of what you do.
Yes. Seeing them in the community and yep. Very enjoyable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some of the clinical trials that we do are for advanced disease. And I know that oftentimes patients that have rare forms of cancer or forms of cancer where we don't have as high a cure rate, they can often progress and are looking for newer forms of treatment. Do you ever get involved in helping them determine, okay, we don't have the clinical trial open for, say, stage 4 cholangiocarcinoma, but we can see if there's other studies that are open elsewhere in the Midwest?
Yep. There's a national research base that we search occasionally and look for something close, or sometimes it's MD Anderson and it's quite a ways away, and at least put them in contact with that and help navigate getting their medical records there if needed and what treatments they've had already.
Okay.
So.
And then do you get to see patients in follow-up after they're done with their treatments? And
Yeah, that's fun. We had a neuropathy study that was open for a long time, and we had several breast cancer patients in that, and it was fun to see them on the follow-up. And still every once in a while I run into one somewhere along the way, so it's really
and that
fun.
particular
We
study
had
was for patients who'd already completed their chemotherapy and had peripheral neuropathy as a side effect of treatment.
Right. It had started during their treatment, but we followed them the long term.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's open it up to questions. So we have a large live studio audience here with us in our hot studio right now. And so you'll get first chance. And if you're watching us live streaming, please put your question in the comment section of whichever software you're using to watch us this evening. So first up, Poon, you get first question.
Can you tell us on the neuropathy study, the results of that, and is there a drug that helped those patients with neuropathy?
Yeah, it was not using a drug. It was monitoring for the neuropathy side effects and looking at more symptom management of it. And matter of fact, just like a few weeks ago, they're getting ready to publish. It's closing, so they're gathering all of the data on it, but we don't have those results yet. Yeah.
And was it a single arm study or was it a 2-arm study?
It was a single arm study. It was more of an observational,
more of learning more
surveying
about
what those, if they were having neuropathy, what they were doing to treat the neuropathy, and completing surveys along the way. And even when they were done with treatment, did the neuropathy resolve or did it continue, and what were they doing for treatment?
Okay.
Mhm.
Kevin.
Yes, as patients get older, they realize, I've been aging out of a lot of medical care. I won't need it someday. What's the oldest person you've ever enlisted in a study?
Oh. I don't know if we got to study, but I had a patient that was 76 and 78. Uh-huh.
Yeah, there was a time, and I'm not exactly positive, but I think that the rules changed. So it used to be common when clinical
Yeah.
trials are written to say you had to be, let's say, under 60 to enroll in the study. And then there was thought that there was age discrimination and
Mhm.
that, not everyone of a certain chronologic age is the same. And so there was a lot of discouragement about putting an age requirement, an
Mhm.
upper limit. And so the rules were written more like trying to get at the functional status. How functional are they? What are the blood tests? What are the parameters that are more objective? Well, age is objective, but that are more pertaining to the health of the patient rather than just the
Mhm.
chronologic age. So correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the studies don't say you can't enroll if you're over a certain age.
No, most of ours are 18 and older. There are a few that have 18 to 70 or 18 to 74, but most of ours are 18 and older. We do have a few on the lower spectrum that are 18 to 39. So
Yeah, and it might be a study looking at young adults
Yep,
where it's
yep,
just
exactly.
confined to a certain age group. The ones where you might still get age is the screening studies. Well, we only have one screening study, but you generally for screening mammograms at a certain age recommend stopping. Did that one have an
It
age?
did 74
Yeah.
on that one.
And the
Mhm.
same with
But if they enrolled at 74,
they could continue.
they can keep on the study for 8 years. So beyond that. So I did have a few that were 74 and
when they
willing
got
to
on
do
the
it.
study,
Yep.
and then we're getting
Yep.
also lung cancer screening. There's an age at which you stop screening, and for average risk patients for colonoscopy, there's an age at which it's okay to stop the screening.
Mm-hmm.
But a good question about the
Yeah.
age, because it used to
Yeah.
be more common that there would be an upper age, and now it's more the physiologic function of the person. Yes, Patty.
Hi. I keep waiting for feedback or something. So I wanted to ask about the national research that you do
Mhm.
again, and I am one of those people with rare, weird, very aggressive cancer, and I have already gone through all of the standard treatments and some others. So, what's the process by which a person would come to you to ask for assistance in looking nationally for trials that might be beneficial and appropriate for us?
Yeah, I'm housed in Dr. Deming's office at the Richard Deming Cancer Center, so that would be the place to start. And we would ask a few questions to get down to what we need to find to be able to search on a national basis and see what's out there and available.
And the good thing is that Shannon would have access to all of your medical records already that are
Mhm.
already in our electronic medical record. And then it's sitting down and going through some of the processes you probably have already done yourself, some of those databases that
Mhm.
list all of the known clinical trials around the world
Mhm.
to see, okay, are there some that are open? Like any database, is probably not everybody fills in the database and keeps it up to date. So, the fact that it may not be on the the most common one we search, clinicaltrials.gov. There
Mhm.
are some other ones, but happy to provide that service of working with you to see, is it possible that somewhere in the world, if you're willing to travel, or in the
Mhm.
United States, where there may be a study open for your particular type of cancer and stage.
I'll look too. So I have found two studies that were really, really promising, and I was investigating and in contact with folks, and they have both been paused because of funding being withheld. Is that a common thing as far as you're seeing?
We're funded through a grant, and right now it's business as usual. So
Yeah, I would say I'm aware of one study that was
Yeah.
promptly stopped by executive order. So we had a study, and it was an observational study that happened to be patients who were self-described as LGBTQ,
Mhm.
and that study was stopped for funding
Yep.
purposes. We are worried about overall funding of the National Cancer Institute, and then overall funding of the the National Cancer Institute Community Oncology Research Program, which is funded through everyone is wondering what's going to happen, because there's the budget that's next to be voted on by the Senate has significant, something like $20 billion cut. And then how will that come through the whole overall budget of the NCI, and will that affect the funding of our clinical trials? So
Mhm.
we're worried about it. We have not had to stop any funding, any clinical trials, because of specific funding. The one that I mentioned was was stopped more for ideological reasons than it was for the specific funding.
Mhm.
So right now we are still continuing
Plugging
to
ahead.
accrue patients.
Mhm.
We have not had any cut in our funding to date.
Nope.
Yes.
I got a question from a viewer. Holly's watching on Facebook tonight. She says, or she asks, should they recommend mammograms at a younger age? I personally know a 33-year-old and 18-year-old now battling breast cancer.
Yeah.
Very
So
good question.
we don't right now have any clinical trials that are taking average risk women and saying, okay, let's look at starting mammograms at age 30. But I will say that we definitely do mammograms on women younger than 40 if they are at high risk. And what do I mean by high risk? High risk means that you either have a family history or you have a genetic mutation. So those put you you're no longer in the guidelines for average risk. So in those situations, we would do mammograms at an earlier age. We're probably never going to get to the point of doing mammograms on all women starting at age 20. Number one, mammograms are very unreliable in young women because their breasts are so dense. You're not likely to find something, and you're much more likely to find a false positive. So you would probably cause more harm than benefit. So not only would the financial expense of starting mammograms at age 20 be huge for the overall health, because even if it's covered by insurance, I mean, eventually somebody needs to pay for it. So the expense would be high. You would not likely find many cancers, and you would end up finding a lot of false positives. So we don't believe we should start screening average risk women at much younger ages. But if you have first degree relatives that have breast cancer, or for example, you have a BRCA gene or another genetic mutation that puts you individually at higher risk, then definitely we can start screening. And we might do not just mammograms, we might do MRIs. But again, those are for women at high risk for breast cancer, not at average risk. Let me just, before I take the next question, we do sometimes change. So for example, colorectal cancer screening, went from 50 to now 45 because we've been seeing a lot more individuals in their 40s with colon cancer. So we actually changed the guidelines for average risk people. Again, high risk, we might even screen at an earlier age. And it could be that within the next 5 or 10 years, we might drop the screening age down to 40 for colorectal. So we do, by we, the overall scientific community pays attention to this, and the guidelines do change as needed as we see younger individuals getting different types of cancer. Gary, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a question as to, are you testing new drugs at all? And who's paying for those drugs? Do some of these, can they be paid by the pharmaceutical companies themselves? And if they are to, they look like they're promising, is there some other stage that they go through to be able to go through a study to ensure that, it's good for the population?
Yeah, so most of all of our trials are federally funded. So we don't have the pharmaceutical trials within our group, but there are others in the community that do have pharmaceutical trials of trying those new drugs. So with the federal trials, if there's an experimental drug, the study picks up the cost of that drug.
And the answer to your questions are yes, yes, and yes. There are studies funded by the companies that are making a new drug, and we do understand. There's conflicts of interest when a company that is going to make money, if the result is positive, that there's a conflict of interest. So it's not illegal or immoral to do the studies, but there's usually needs to be then a confirmatory study, and to make sure that there's no bias built into the study that would be biased in favor of approving a drug. So if the company that's making the drug is the company that's doing all the studies, there is a potential bias. So that's a different type of research. It can initially be done and funded by the pharmaceutical companies, but to get to the point of a phase 3 study, you want to get to these federally funded independent research that verifies in a randomized prospective study, not paid for by the manufacturer of that particular drug, to have the highest level of evidence that the drug is efficacious. And then it goes through a whole process through the FDA to get approval for this drug can be used for this type of cancer in this stage. And then once it gets that approval, then it gets on the formularies for insurance companies to pay for it. So that whole process exists. And many times you might start with a smaller study done by the pharmaceutical company that invented that new drug. And then it can expand into eventually an NCI federally funded randomized prospective study. Then the results of that study can be evidence that gets the drug approved by the Federal Drug Administration, the FDA.
I'm just wondering, did most of the most commonly prescribed cancer treatments today start as clinical trials, and what are some of the most famous ones that people would be aware of?
Oh gosh, yes.
All of them, and right now, I mean, you just watch your TV. The ones that are the most recently approved, that are still on a patent, where the drug company is still making a lot of money. There's enough money to make TV commercials to market directly to the consumer. So, you look at Keytruda and Opdivo as two of the very prominent, successful, and very useful drugs that are helping. Those are immunotherapy. So those two come to mind. But any drug that you're seeing a TV commercial for is likely been recently approved through the clinical trial process and has gained FDA approval, and that's why they can market the drug. Other questions?
So let's expand on that just a little bit. So I see a commercial on TV that's an FDA approved drug. Okay. Then I'm all excited and things like that. And I have stage 4 cancer. Do I contact you as a doctor to say, well, this is what I want? Or do you know it and say,
You absolutely can do that.
do
You absolutely can
this
do
here.
that. The commercials are made primarily for the patients to watch, not for the doctors to watch. But sometimes the doctors do watch. You would hope that a cancer doctor has learned about this drug before there's a TV commercial. But the reason they make the TV commercials is for John Doe, who has cancer, sitting in his TV room to say, huh, that looks like a good drug. I'm going to ask my cancer doctor whether that's a drug that I might be, that might work for me. I mean, that's the reason they make the TV commercials, is so that the patients will ask their doctors, am I a candidate for this drug?
Kathy's watching on Facebook tonight as well. She says, are most trials only open to patients that only have cancer and don't have other medical problems?
No, there are clinical trials for all sorts of different disease processes. We've been focusing on cancer because I'm a cancer doctor and we
Yep.
do cancer clinical trials in our cancer center. But absolutely, the same process applies to, Alzheimer's disease and multiple sclerosis and ALS and various types of heart diseases and gastrointestinal diseases. So every disease process, there are processes by which clinical trials are done for new drugs that may be beneficial for that particular disease process.
But to get a cancer clinical trial, do you just have cancer only? Or
Well,
do you have?
yeah.
Okay,
So
yeah.
like our screening cancer was a breast cancer one. So they didn't have to have breast cancer. They had to be a certain age group and meet a few requirements. It
But
wasn't
they could have other diseases.
correct.
Yes. And so
Right.
that
just not
particular
cancer.
study did not exclude
Right.
them.
Right. So it didn't exclude it excluded them if they had cancer
Yeah.
because it was a screening trial.
But if a patient
Mhm.
has a number of other diseases, let's say fibromyalgia, osteoporosis, and lupus, and they have cancer, can they still go on a clinical trial?
They could
Most
very
of the
well,
time,
yeah.
yes.
There are very few exclusions in
Yeah.
those chronic diseases as long as they're well controlled.
Yes. So
Mhm.
as long as those other diseases are well controlled and we
Mhm.
expect that they would not result in premature
Mhm.
death, then they could go on the study. The exception would be if the medicines that are on the clinical trial are medicines that might be harmful for their other disease processes or might interact with medicines that are on for the other disease processes, then they might be excluded. But in general, having other diseases, other diagnoses for which you take medications, generally speaking, don't exclude you from participating in a cancer clinical trial.
Correct. Mhm.
We have time for one more question.
None?
All right. We're almost out of time. I want to
Okay.
thank Shannon
Thank
Harden,
you for having me.
research nurse with Iowa Oncology Research Association, for being with us and talking about clinical trials. If you know someone that would benefit by watching this program over again, it's available on demand beginning tomorrow at the Above and Beyond Cancer YouTube channel and the Mercy Cancer Center website. Thanks for joining us. Please join us again next week.